16-year-old Byron Anthony Jarvis stood before Peoria County Chief Judge Catherine Gorman on March 21, 2025, in the Peoria County Courthouse in Illinois, wearing an orange juvenile detention jumpsuit and wrist restraints, his previously confident demeanor replaced by visible fear and disbelief, as Judge Gorman prepared to sentence him for the execution-style murder of 17-year-old Davy P. Brown Bay, who Byron had shot 4 times at close range, 3 bullets to the head, on a sunny afternoon in August 2023, in the East Bluff neighborhood of Peoria, while a group of children, including a 10-year-old boy, watched in horror as Byron calmly approached his victim on a scooter, pulled a gun from his waistband, fired multiple shots into Davy's head as he stood defenseless on the sidewalk, then casually rode away, leaving Davy dying in a pool of blood on the concrete. Before we continue with this disturbing case, please subscribe to our channel if you haven't already, and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. Your support is what allows us to continue bringing these important stories to light. For the 19 months between his arrest in August 2023 and his sentencing in March 2025, Byron had maintained an attitude of defiant confidence that shocked investigators, prosecutors, and even his own defense attorneys. A confidence rooted in Byron's mistaken belief that because he was only 14 years old at the time he murdered Davy Brown Bay, the juvenile justice system would protect him from serious consequences, that the worst he might face would be a few years in juvenile detention, followed by his release when he turned 21, with his record sealed and expunged, allowing him to start fresh as if the murder had never happened. In recorded phone calls from juvenile detention, Byron could be heard telling friends and family members, "Don't worry, I'll be out soon. They can't do nothing to me because I was a kid when it happened. Juvenile record, you know. It all goes away when I turn 21. I'll be back on the streets in a few years." Byron's defense attorneys had tried repeatedly to explain to him that this was not how the law worked, that Illinois law allows prosecutors to petition for automatic transfer of juveniles aged 13 and older to adult court for serious felonies like murder, and that if he were convicted of first-degree murder in adult court, he could face decades in prison, potentially the rest of his life. But Byron refused to take the threat seriously, apparently convinced that his youth would shield him from real consequences, that the system couldn't truly send a 14-year-old to adult prison for life. This confidence persisted through his arrest, through the transfer hearing where prosecutors successfully argued that Byron should be tried as an adult, given the cold-blooded nature of the execution-style killing, through his trial where surveillance video clearly showed Byron shooting Davy at close range while a 10-year-old witness watched, and through the guilty verdict in December 2024, when a jury convicted Byron of first-degree murder after deliberating for less than 3 hours. What Byron fundamentally failed to understand, what his cavalier attitude and misplaced confidence in the juvenile system prevented him from grasping, was that the United States has some of the harshest juvenile sentencing laws in the developed world, that thousands of teenagers are tried as adults each year in American courts, and that judges and prosecutors have increasingly taken the position that violent juveniles who commit adult crimes should face adult consequences regardless of their age. When Judge Catherine Gorman pronounced sentence on March 21, 2025, 55 years in the Illinois Department of Corrections, with Byron required to serve at least 20 years before becoming eligible for parole, meaning he would be at least 34 years old before he could even apply for potential release, and more likely would serve far longer, given the nature of his crime and his documented lack of remorse. The shock on Byron's face was visible to everyone in the courtroom. The teenager who had thought his juvenile status would save him from serious consequences suddenly understood that he would spend the next 2 decades minimum in maximum security prison, missing his entire youth, his 20s, and much of his 30s, paying for the choice he made on a summer afternoon in 2023, when he decided that shooting Davy Brownbay in the head would somehow earn him respect and status on the streets of Peoria. Byron Anthony Jarvis was born on April 8, 2009, in Peoria, Illinois, to Shanice Jarvis, a 22-year-old single mother who worked sporadically in retail and service industry jobs while struggling with poverty, housing instability, and the challenges of raising a child with minimal support and resources. Byron's father, whose identity Shanice was uncertain about, given her involvement with multiple men around the time of Byron's conception, was never involved in Byron's life and may not have known Byron existed. From his earliest days, Byron was exposed to chaos, instability, and violence that would shape his development and worldview in profoundly damaging ways. Shanice loved her son, but was ill-equipped to provide the stable, nurturing environment children need to develop into healthy, well-adjusted adults. She moved frequently, sometimes staying with relatives or friends, sometimes in subsidized housing, occasionally homeless, and staying in shelters with infant Byron. Money was always tight. Shanice worked when she could find employment, but without reliable childcare and lacking job skills or education beyond high school. She cycled through low-wage positions that barely covered rent and basic necessities, leaving nothing for extras or emergencies. When Byron needed new clothes, shoes, school supplies, or other items children require, Shanice often couldn't afford them, creating situations where Byron went to school in worn, ill-fitting clothing that made him a target for teasing and social exclusion. Beyond financial struggles, Byron was exposed to violence from an early age. Shanice had relationships with men who were sometimes involved in criminal activity, who were sometimes abusive toward Shanice in Byron's presence, who normalized violence as a way of resolving conflicts and establishing dominance. Byron witnessed domestic violence incidents, heard gunshots in his neighborhood regularly, saw fights and drug deals and police raids that most middle-class children never encounter. By the time Byron started elementary school at age 5, he had already internalized the message that violence was normal, that might made right, that the strongest survived and the weak were victimized. Byron's behavior at school reflected his chaotic home environment and trauma exposure. He was aggressive toward other students, quick to fight over minor provocations, defiant toward teachers' authority. He struggled academically, not necessarily because he lacked intelligence, but because he came to school without having eaten breakfast, without adequate sleep, sometimes wearing the same clothes for days because laundry facilities weren't available, and carrying the emotional weight of whatever drama or violence had occurred at home the previous night. Teachers noted that Byron seemed emotionally dysregulated, unable to manage his feelings appropriately, prone to explosive outbursts that disrupted the classroom and made other students afraid of him. By 3rd grade, Byron had been suspended multiple times for fighting and threatening other students. School counselors tried to intervene, calling Shanice in for meetings to discuss Byron's behavior and recommend services including therapy and possible evaluation for emotional disorders. But Shanice, working multiple jobs and dealing with her own struggles, often didn't follow through on recommendations. She would agree to take Byron to therapy, but then miss appointments because she couldn't get off work or couldn't arrange transportation. She would commit to implementing behavior plans at home, but then lacked the energy or knowledge to follow through consistently. Byron's behavioral problems continued and intensified. As Byron entered middle school in 2020-2021, around age 11, he became increasingly involved in street culture and gang activity that dominated his neighborhood on Peoria's East Bluff. The East Bluff is a historically African-American neighborhood that has struggled with poverty, unemployment, gun violence, and gang activity for decades. For young boys like Byron growing up in this environment with absent fathers and overwhelmed mothers, street gangs often fill the void left by absent family structure, offering a sense of belonging, identity, protection, and opportunity to earn money through illegal activities. Byron was drawn into this world gradually. It started with older boys in the neighborhood befriending him, giving him attention and validation he didn't receive at home, making him feel important and valued. They would give Byron small amounts of money or new shoes or other items that Shanice couldn't afford, creating gratitude and loyalty. Then they would ask Byron to do small favors, deliver a package to someone, hold something for them, watch for police in a certain area. These favors gradually escalated to more serious involvement, including lookout duty during drug deals, carrying weapons for older gang members who didn't want to risk being caught with guns, and eventually participating directly in the violence that characterized gang life in Peoria. By age 13 in 2022, Byron was deeply embedded in gang culture. He identified with a specific gang set on the East Bluff, wore their colors, threw their signs in social media photos, and had adopted the street name his associates used for him. He had been arrested twice, once for retail theft when he was caught shoplifting from a store, and once for battery after he assaulted another student at school. But both cases were handled in juvenile court, where Byron received probation and was ordered to complete anger management classes and community service. These interventions had minimal impact on Byron's trajectory. He viewed the juvenile justice system as essentially toothless. He had committed crimes, gotten caught, and received what felt like negligible consequences, reinforcing his belief that he could act without serious repercussions. Byron's involvement in social media was significant and would later become crucial evidence in his case. Like many teenagers in gang culture, Byron was extremely active on Instagram, Snapchat, and other platforms, constantly posting content designed to project an image of toughness, street credibility, and willingness to use violence. His social media accounts featured photos of Byron holding guns, flashing gang signs, posing with stacks of cash, and posting threatening messages directed at rival gang members. In the world Byron inhabited, social media was a crucial arena for establishing reputation, issuing challenges, and responding to perceived disrespect, all of which could escalate into real-world violence. Darby Preston Brown Bay was born on December 2, 2005 in Peoria, Illinois, to parents who worked hard to provide a stable home despite the challenges of raising children in a struggling neighborhood. Darby was a junior at Manual High School in Peoria, a student who showed promise academically and athletically, despite the difficult environment he navigated daily. His family would later describe him as a loving son and brother, a young man who had dreams of attending college and building a better life than what his neighborhood typically offered. Someone who tried to stay away from serious gang involvement, even though he knew people involved in street life and occasionally associated with them, as was almost inevitable for young men growing up in his neighborhood. Davy and Byron knew each other casually through the neighborhood and social media. They weren't close friends, but they existed in overlapping social circles where everyone knew everyone at least by reputation. In the complex world of youth gang culture in Peoria, relationships are fluid and allegiances shift. Someone you were friendly with last month might become an enemy this month, based on gang affiliations, perceived disrespect on social media, conflicts over girls, or disputes that escalate from minor to deadly with shocking speed. In the weeks leading up to August 2023, tension had been building between Byron's gang set and rivals with whom Davi was loosely associated. There had been back and forth on social media, disrespectful posts, threatening comments, videos that called out specific individuals or groups. Several shootings had occurred in the area as this conflict intensified, though no one had been killed yet. In this environment, young men like Byron felt constant pressure to prove their toughness, to respond to perceived disrespect, to demonstrate they weren't afraid and were willing to use violence to defend their reputation and status. Byron had acquired a handgun, a 9mm pistol that he obtained through connections in his gang network, purchased illegally or possibly stolen. The type of weapon that flows through American inner cities in stunning quantities despite being illegal for minors to possess. Byron carried this gun regularly, tucked in his waistband, sometimes showing it off to associates, posting photos with it on social media. In his world, being armed was both protective, reducing the chance of being victimized by rivals, and status enhancing, proving you were serious and dangerous. On August 12, 2023, a hot Saturday afternoon in Peoria, events unfolded that would end Davy Brown Bay's life and destroy Byron Jarvis's future. The day started normally. Byron was hanging out in his neighborhood with associates, smoking marijuana, listening to music, the typical activities of teenagers with nothing productive to occupy their time. At some point during the afternoon, Byron saw social media posts from Davy and others in Davy's social circle, posts that Byron interpreted as disrespectful toward Byron's gang set, though the post didn't name Byron specifically or issue any direct threats. In the toxic logic of gang culture, perceived disrespect demands response. If someone disrespects you or your set and you don't respond, you look weak, you lose status. Others see you as a target. Byron felt pressure to do something, to demonstrate that disrespect wouldn't be tolerated. He told associates that he was going to handle it, that he was going to find Davy and make him regret the social media posts. Several people who were with Byron that afternoon would later tell police they didn't think he was serious, or they thought he just meant he would confront Davy and they might fight, not that Byron actually intended to kill someone. But Byron took his gun, put it in his waistband, and set out on an electric scooter, a mode of transportation popular with young people in Peoria for getting around the neighborhood, to look for Davy Brown Bay. Around 3:45 p.m. that afternoon, Byron spotted Davy on a sidewalk in the East Bluff neighborhood, hanging out with several other young people, including a 10-year-old boy who looked up to the older teenagers and liked being included when they let him hang around. Davy was standing on the sidewalk, talking and laughing with friends, completely unaware that Byron was approaching with lethal intent. There were other people around, neighbors sitting on porches, children playing, cars driving by. It was broad daylight in a residential neighborhood on a summer Saturday when people were out enjoying the weather. What happened next was captured on surveillance video from a home across the street, video that would become the centerpiece of the prosecution's case against Byron and would be so disturbing that Judge Gorman would later cite it specifically when explaining her sentencing decision. The surveillance video showed Byron riding up on the scooter, slowing as he approached the group where Davy stood. Several people in the group noticed Byron approaching, but didn't react with alarm. They apparently thought Byron was just riding by, or maybe coming to talk. Then Byron stopped the scooter approximately 10 feet from where Davy stood. Byron pulled the gun from his waistband. For a brief moment, perhaps 2 or 3 seconds, Byron and Davy made eye contact, and Davy's expression changed from casual to shocked as he realized what was about to happen. Davy raised his hands in a defensive gesture, his mouth opening as if to speak or shout. But before Davy could say anything or attempt to run, Byron extended the gun and fired. The first shot hit Davy in the chest, causing him to stagger backward. The other young people on the sidewalk began screaming and scattering, running for cover. But Byron didn't flee. He advanced toward Davy as Davy stumbled and fell to the sidewalk, now mortally wounded. Byron stood over Davy and fired again, hitting him in the shoulder. Then Byron aimed at Davy's head and fired 2 more times at point-blank range, execution style, ensuring Davy would not survive. The 10-year-old witness, frozen in shock and terror only feet away, watched the entire attack unfold before his eyes. The surveillance video, which ran for approximately 10 seconds showing the shooting, captured Byron's body language and behavior. He was calm, methodical, deliberate. This was not a panicked shooting during a chaotic fight, not a gun accidentally discharging during a struggle, not impulsive violence in the heat of sudden rage. Byron approached his target, drew his weapon, and systematically shot Davy multiple times, including the execution-style shots to the head, after Davy was already down and incapacitated. The video would later be played for the jury at Byron's trial, and multiple jurors would be seen crying or looking away, unable to watch the cold-blooded murder of a 17-year-old boy who had his whole life ahead of him. After firing the final shots into Davy's head, Byron calmly put the gun back in his waistband, got back on his scooter, and rode away from the scene as if he had simply completed an errand. Behind him, Davy Brown Bay lay dying on the sidewalk, blood pooling beneath his head, while the 10-year-old witness and other traumatized young people screamed and cried around him. Neighbors who had heard the shots called 911, and within minutes police and paramedics arrived at the scene. Paramedics found Davy unresponsive, with multiple gunshot wounds, including the catastrophic head wounds from the close-range shots Byron had fired. They attempted life-saving measures and rushed Davy to OSF St. Francis Medical Center in Peoria, but the injuries were too severe. Davy was pronounced dead at the hospital at approximately 4:30 p.m. on August 12, 2023, less than an hour after Byron shot him. The medical examiner would later determine that Davy died from multiple gunshot wounds, with the shots to his head causing fatal brain trauma and the chest wound causing massive internal bleeding. Either wound would have been fatal on its own, but the combination ensured Davy had no chance of survival. The investigation into Davy's murder was led by the Peoria Police Department's Criminal Investigations Division, with Detective Marcus Hayes assigned as lead investigator. Detective Hayes and his team immediately began canvassing the neighborhood for witnesses and evidence. Multiple witnesses had seen the shooting or its aftermath, and several were willing to talk to police despite the neighborhood's general code of not cooperating with law enforcement. The 10-year-old witness, deeply traumatized by what he had seen, gave a detailed statement to detectives in which he identified Byron Jarvis as the shooter. He knew Byron from the neighborhood and had no doubt about what he had witnessed. Crucially, detectives obtained the surveillance video from the home across the street that had captured the entire shooting. The video quality was excellent, clear enough to see Byron's face, his actions, the methodical nature of the attack. This video evidence was devastating to any potential defense Byron might try to present, as it showed conclusively that this was premeditated murder, not self-defense or accidental shooting or heat of passion violence, but calculated execution of an unarmed victim. Detectives also analyzed Byron's social media accounts, finding posts and messages that provided context for the shooting. In the hours before the murder, Byron had posted increasingly aggressive content on Instagram, including a post that read, "Disrespect won't be tolerated," and another showing Byron holding what appeared to be a handgun with a caption, "Time to handle business." After the shooting, Byron posted additional content that investigators interpreted as celebrating or boasting about the murder, including posts that referenced the shooting in coded language and suggested Byron felt pride rather than remorse about what he had done. Based on the surveillance video, the eyewitness testimony, and the social media evidence, Detective Hayes obtained an arrest warrant for Byron Jarvis for first-degree murder. On August 14, 2023, 2 days after the shooting, a tactical team from the Peoria Police Department executed the warrant, arresting Byron at his mother's apartment, where he had been hiding since the shooting. When officers entered the residence, they found Byron in a bedroom, and a search of the room uncovered the 9mm handgun used in Davy's murder. Byron still had the murder weapon, apparently not having disposed of it, another example of the poor decision-making and overconfidence that characterized his actions throughout this case. Byron was taken into custody without resistance and transported to the Peoria Police Department for processing and questioning. Initially, Byron was held in juvenile detention given his age, 14 years old at the time of his arrest. But prosecutors immediately filed a petition for automatic transfer to adult court under Illinois law, which allows juveniles aged 13 and older, who are charged with first-degree murder, to be automatically transferred to adult court, where they face the same potential penalties as adult defendants. The transfer hearing was held in September 2023, approximately 1 month after Byron's arrest. At the hearing, prosecutors presented evidence of the premeditated execution-style nature of the murder, the surveillance video showing Byron's cold-blooded actions, and expert testimony about Byron's sophistication and prior involvement in criminal activity that suggested he was not an impulsive child who made a terrible mistake, but rather a calculating young gang member who made a deliberate choice to commit murder. Defense attorneys argued that Byron's youth and potential for rehabilitation warranted keeping his case in juvenile court, where he would face less severe penalties and have access to therapeutic interventions designed for young offenders. Judge Robert Williams, who presided over the transfer hearing, ruled that Byron's case would be transferred to adult court. In his written decision, Judge Williams noted, "The defendant, though only 14 years of age, planned and executed a cold-blooded murder in broad daylight, firing multiple shots into his victim's head at close range, while witnesses, including a young child, watched in horror." The surveillance video shows a level of callousness and deliberation that is deeply disturbing. While the court recognizes that the defendant is young and that adolescent brains are still developing, the nature of this crime and the defendant's documented gang involvement and prior criminal history suggests that he poses a serious ongoing threat to public safety that cannot be adequately addressed in the juvenile justice system. This case is transferred to adult court. Byron's transfer to adult court meant he now faced first-degree murder charges that carried a potential sentence of 20 years to life in prison. dramatically different from the juvenile court sanctions he had apparently expected, which would have involved confinement in juvenile facilities until age 21, followed by release with his record sealed. Despite this development, Byron apparently still didn't fully grasp the gravity of his situation. In recorded phone calls from jail, Byron could be heard telling family members, "Don't worry, they're trying to scare me, but my lawyer says I'll probably just get a few years. And once I turn 21, they have to let me out. That's how juvenile law works." These statements reflected Byron's fundamental misunderstanding of what it meant to be tried as an adult. He was no longer in the juvenile system. He was facing adult criminal charges with adult penalties. Byron's trial began in December 2024, 16 months after the murder. The prosecution, led by Peoria County State's Attorney Jody Hoos and Assistant State's Attorney Dave Kenny, presented a comprehensive case that left little doubt about Byron's guilt. The evidence included the surveillance video showing Byron shooting Davey multiple times, including execution-style shots to the head after Davey was already down, testimony from the 10-year-old eyewitness who identified Byron as the shooter and described watching the entire attack unfold, forensic evidence including ballistics matching the murder weapon found in Byron's room, to the bullets recovered from Davey's body, and the crime scene Byron's social media posts before and after the murder, showing his intent and subsequent lack of remorse. Expert testimony from gang investigators explaining the context of the murder within ongoing gang conflicts in Peoria, the medical examiner's testimony describing Davey's wounds and cause of death. The defense, led by public defenders from the Peoria County Public Defender's Office, faced an almost impossible task. They couldn't credibly argue Byron was innocent. The video evidence was too clear, the eyewitness too certain, the forensic evidence too strong. Instead, they attempted to argue that Byron had acted impulsively in response to provocation, that he had been influenced by older gang members who encouraged violence, and that he was still a child whose brain was not fully developed and whose capacity for rehabilitation meant he deserved a chance at eventual release. Defense attorneys called expert witnesses on adolescent brain development, who testified about the well-established neuroscience showing that teenage brains, particularly in areas governing impulse control and considering long-term consequences, are not fully developed until the mid-20s. They presented testimony about Byron's difficult childhood, his exposure to violence and trauma, the lack of positive male role models in his life, and the environmental factors that had led him into gang involvement. They argued that Byron, while guilty of a terrible crime, was still a child who deserved to be sentenced with consideration of his youth and potential to change. But the prosecution systematically countered each defense argument. They showed that Byron's actions were not impulsive but planned. He had posted about handling business on social media, had armed himself and gone looking for Davey, and had approached and shot him in a calm, methodical manner shown on video. They argued that while adolescent brain development is real, it doesn't excuse cold-blooded murder, and that Byron had known exactly what he was doing when he fired multiple bullets into Davey's head at close range. They presented evidence of Byron's social media posts after the murder showing pride rather than remorse, suggesting he lacked the capacity for rehabilitation the defense claimed he possessed. The most emotional testimony came from Davey Brown Bay's family. His mother, Patricia Brown, took the stand to deliver a victim impact statement that brought many in the courtroom to tears, including some jurors. Patricia described her son as a loving young man who had struggled to stay away from serious gang involvement, who had dreams of attending college and building a better life, who had been doing better in school and making plans for his future when Byron killed him. "My son was 17 years old," Patricia said, her voice breaking with emotion. "He had his whole life ahead of him. He wasn't perfect, what 17-year-old boy is. He made mistakes. He got in trouble sometimes. But he was trying. He was going to school. He was talking about college. He wanted to be better than what our neighborhood usually produces. And Byron Jarvis took that away from him. Byron rode up on a scooter in broad daylight and shot my son 4 times, 3 of them in his head, and then rode away like it was nothing. A 10-year-old child watched my son get executed on the sidewalk and will be traumatized for the rest of his life. My son died on that sidewalk. And for what? For some perceived disrespect on social media. For gang reputation. It makes no sense. It's pure evil." Patricia looked directly at Byron, who sat at the defense table staring down at his hands, and continued, "You took my baby from me. You took him from his father, his brothers and sisters, his grandparents, his friends, everyone who loved him. You ended his life and destroyed ours. And I heard that you've been telling people in jail that you'll be out soon because you're a juvenile. I hope that's not true. I hope you spend the rest of your life in prison for what you did. You don't deserve to ever walk free after executing my son in the street like he was nothing." The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours before returning a guilty verdict on all counts, including first-degree murder. When the verdict was read on December 18, 2024, Byron showed minimal reaction, simply nodding slightly as if he had expected this outcome. But according to observers, Byron still seemed to believe that his age would result in a lenient sentence, that he might receive 10 or 15 years and be released in his late 20s or early 30s, still young enough to rebuild his life. The sentencing hearing was scheduled for March 21, 2025, approximately 3 months after the guilty verdict. During this period, both sides prepared sentencing arguments, and the court received a pre-sentence investigation report detailing Byron's background, his prior juvenile record, psychological evaluations, and assessments of his risk to re-offend and potential for rehabilitation. The sentencing hearing began with additional victim impact statements from Davy's family and friends, each describing the impact of his murder on their lives and the community. Several spoke about the 10-year-old witness who had watched the execution and was now in therapy for PTSD, having nightmares about the shooting, afraid to go outside, traumatized in ways that would affect him for years or decades. The prosecution argued for the maximum sentence available under Illinois law, 60 years to natural life. Assistant State's Attorney Dave Kenney told Judge Gorman, "Your Honor, this was not a momentary lapse in judgment by a troubled teenager. This was planned, cold-blooded murder. Byron Jarvis armed himself, sought out his victim, and methodically shot him 4 times, including execution-style shots to the head while a child watched. The surveillance video shows a level of callousness that is chilling. And since his arrest, Byron has shown no genuine remorse. He has bragged to associates, he has minimized his actions, and he has repeatedly expressed confidence that his age would protect him from serious consequences. The protection of the community and the interests of justice require the maximum sentence." The defense argued for the minimum sentence available for first-degree murder, 20 years, with credit for time served and potential for good behavior credit that could result in Byron's release in his early 30s. Defense attorney Marcus Wilson argued, "Your Honor, Byron Jarvis is 16 years old. He was 14 when this crime occurred. Science tells us unequivocally that adolescent brains are not fully developed, that teenagers are more impulsive, less able to consider consequences, more susceptible to peer pressure and negative influences. Byron grew up in one of Peoria's most violent neighborhoods with minimal parental supervision, exposed to violence and trauma that no child should experience. He made a terrible, irreversible mistake that ended Davy Brownbay's life and devastated that family. But he is still a child, and sentencing him to die in prison abandons any hope that he can change and be rehabilitated. We ask the court to impose a sentence that, while lengthy and appropriate given the seriousness of the crime, preserves some possibility that Byron can one day, decades from now after extensive rehabilitation, have a chance at freedom. After hearing all arguments, Judge Catherine Gorman delivered her sentencing decision. Her remarks were lengthy and provided clear reasoning for the sentence she was about to impose. "Mr. Jarvis," Judge Gorman began, "I have presided over countless criminal cases in my career, and this is one of the most disturbing I have encountered. The surveillance video of you shooting Davy Brownbay shows a level of cold-blooded violence that is shocking regardless of the age of the perpetrator, and particularly shocking coming from a 14-year-old boy. You didn't shoot Davy once in a moment of panic or rage. You shot him 4 times, including 3 shots to his head at close range after he was already incapacitated and posed no threat to you. A 10-year-old child witnessed this execution and will carry that trauma for the rest of his life. Davy's family will never recover from losing him to such senseless violence." Judge Gorman continued, "I have carefully considered all the arguments presented by both sides. I have reviewed the neuroscience research on adolescent brain development. I understand that you grew up in a difficult environment with significant challenges and trauma. But I have also reviewed the evidence of this crime, your prior criminal history, your social media posts showing pride in gang involvement and violence, and the recorded phone calls where you joked about this case and expressed confidence that your age would protect you from serious consequences. These facts paint a picture of a young man who, while certainly influenced by his environment, made a deliberate choice to commit murder and has shown no genuine remorse or capacity for rehabilitation." Judge Gorman then addressed directly the issue that Byron had apparently misunderstood throughout the legal proceedings. "Mr. Jarvis, you have apparently believed that because you were 14 at the time of this crime, the juvenile justice system would protect you and you would be released after a few years with your record sealed. That is not how the law works when a juvenile commits murder and is tried as an adult. You are not in juvenile court anymore. You were transferred to adult court, convicted by a jury of adults, and you face adult penalties. Your age is a factor I must consider, and I have considered it, but it does not shield you from the consequences of your actions." Judge Gorman pronounced her sentence. "It is therefore the judgment of this court that you be sentenced to 55 years in the Illinois Department of Corrections for first-degree murder. Under Illinois law, you must serve at least 20 years of this sentence before becoming eligible for parole. You will begin serving this sentence in juvenile facilities, but you will be transferred to adult prison when you turn 21. This sentence reflects the seriousness of your crime, the need to protect the community, and the minimal likelihood that you will be successfully rehabilitated given your lack of remorse and your history of violence." Judge Gorman added a final statement that would be widely quoted in media coverage of the sentencing. "I want to address the issue of young people carrying guns, which has become an epidemic in this community and across the country. To all the young people who think carrying a gun makes you tough or cool or powerful, I want you to hear this. It's not cute. It's not fine. It's not a video game where you respawn after you die. When you shoot someone, they don't come back. Davy Brownbay is dead forever. His family's lives are destroyed forever. and Byron Jarvis will spend the next 20 years minimum in prison, likely much longer. That is the reality of gun violence. Court is adjourned. As Judge Gorman finished pronouncing sentence, Byron's reaction was visible and dramatic. The confident, defiant expression he had maintained throughout much of the proceedings crumbled. His eyes filled with tears. His shoulders slumped. For the first time, Byron appeared to truly comprehend that he would not be released in a few years when he turned 21, that his juvenile status had not saved him from adult consequences, that he would spend at minimum the next 20 years, and likely far longer, in maximum security prison, missing his entire youth and young adulthood, possibly never experiencing freedom again as an adult. Byron's mother Shanice, sitting in the gallery, broke down crying and had to be comforted by family members. Other relatives expressed a mix of relief that justice had been served for Davy and sadness that Byron, still so young, would spend decades in prison. Davy Brownbay's family members wept with relief that Byron had received a significant sentence and would not be released any time soon to potentially hurt anyone else. As bailiffs moved to escort Byron from the courtroom to begin his 55-year sentence, Byron turned to look back at his mother one last time. Shanice was crying, her face devastated by the knowledge that her son, despite all his mistakes and the terrible crime he had committed, would spend the next 2 decades minimum behind bars. Byron mouthed, "I'm sorry," to his mother, whether apologizing for the crime he had committed or for the disappointment he had caused her was unclear. Then Byron was led away through the door that would take him first to juvenile detention, and then, when he turned 21, to adult maximum security prison, where he would remain for at least the next 15 years after that, missing his entire youth and young adulthood. As of December 2025, Byron Jarvis remains incarcerated in the Illinois juvenile justice system, currently age 16, serving his 55-year sentence with minimum 20 years before parole eligibility. When Byron turns 21 in 2030, he will be transferred to adult prison, likely Stateville Correctional Center, or another maximum security facility in Illinois, where he will serve at least until 2043, when he becomes eligible to apply for parole at age 34. Given the nature of his crime, his lack of demonstrated remorse, and the fact that parole is rarely granted for first-degree murder at the first hearing, it is far more likely that Byron will serve significantly longer than the minimum 20 years, possibly remaining incarcerated into his 40s, 50s or longer. The aftermath of Davy Brownbay's murder and Byron Jarvis's conviction had significant impact on the Peoria community and sparked broader conversations about youth violence, gun trafficking, and the juvenile justice system. Davy's family established a scholarship fund in his name to help other young people from Peoria's East Bluff neighborhood attend college, trying to create something positive from the tragedy of his loss. Patricia Brown became an advocate speaking to young people about the consequences of gun violence, showing them photos of Davy and describing what it's like to lose a child to street violence, urging them to make different choices than the ones that led to her son's death. The 10-year-old witness who watched Byron execute Davy received extensive trauma therapy through victim services programs, but continues to struggle with PTSD and nightmares years after witnessing the shooting. His family spoke publicly about the invisible victims of gun violence, the witnesses, particularly children, who see violence and carry that trauma for life even though they weren't physically injured. The case also renewed debate about Illinois' laws regarding transfer of juveniles to adult court for serious crimes. Juvenile justice advocates argued that Byron's 55-year sentence was excessive for someone who committed the crime at age 14, that it violated principles of age-appropriate sentencing and abandoned hope for rehabilitation. They pointed to research showing that even adolescents who commit serious violence can change dramatically as their brains mature into their 20s, and that extremely lengthy sentences for juvenile offenders are neither necessary for public safety nor effective at deterring other young people from violence. But victims' rights advocates and prosecutors defended the sentence as appropriate, given the cold-blooded nature of Byron's crime and his lack of remorse. Byron Jarvis executed a 17-year-old boy in broad daylight while a child watched, said one victim's advocate. He fired 3 bullets into Davy's head at close range. He showed no mercy and has shown no genuine remorse. The fact that he was 14 doesn't change what he did or make him less dangerous. The 55-year sentence with 20-year minimum protects the community and ensures that if Byron is ever released, it will only be after decades of demonstrated change. The case has been studied by criminologists and psychologists interested in understanding how adolescents become involved in lethal violence and what interventions might prevent such tragedies. Analysis of Byron's case revealed multiple points where intervention might have altered his trajectory. If his early behavioral problems in elementary school had been addressed with intensive family support services, if his gang involvement at age 11 or 12 had triggered intervention from juvenile justice or social services, if Illinois had stronger laws preventing juveniles from accessing firearms, if Peoria had more robust programs providing positive alternatives to gang involvement for at-risk youth. But these what-ifs don't change the reality that on August 12, 2023, Byron Jarvis made a choice to arm himself with a gun, seek out Davy Brown Bay, and execute him on a public sidewalk while witnesses watched. That choice destroyed 2 lives. Davy's was ended, and Byron's was irrevocably altered. His youth and freedom forfeit, his future reduced to decades in prison cells. The question of whether Byron will ever develop genuine remorse and rehabilitation remains open. 16-year-old Byron Jarvis in 2025, just beginning to serve his 55-year sentence, is not the same person as 36-year-old Byron Jarvis will be in 2045 if he's still incarcerated then, having spent 22 years in prison. Research on brain development and human psychology suggests that Byron's personality, values, and behavior may change substantially as he matures, particularly if he receives education, therapy, and other interventions during his incarceration. It's possible that by his 30s, Byron will have developed genuine remorse for killing Davy, will have addressed his trauma and the environmental factors that led him into gang violence, and will have transformed into someone very different from the cold-blooded 14-year-old captured on surveillance video executing his victim. But it's also possible that Byron will remain fundamentally unchanged, that prison will harden rather than rehabilitate him, that he will continue to lack genuine empathy or remorse, and that he will remain a danger to others if ever released. Only time will tell which path Byron's life takes, and that determination will eventually fall to the Illinois Prisoner Review Board when Byron applies for parole decades from now. What is certain is that Byron Jarvis's case stands as a stark example of what happens when teenagers believe their youth will shield them from serious consequences for serious crimes. Byron thought his juvenile status would save him from adult penalties, that at worst he might serve a few years and be released in his early 20s with a fresh start. Instead, he received a 55-year sentence in adult court and will spend at minimum 2 decades in maximum security prison, and likely far longer. The case also serves as a memorial to Davy Preston Brown Bay, a 17-year-old young man whose life was just beginning, who had dreams and potential and people who loved him, whose future was stolen by 4 bullets on a summer afternoon in Peoria. Davy deserved to graduate from high school, to attend college, to build a career and family, to live a full life. Instead, he died on a sidewalk at 17, another victim of the gun violence epidemic that claims thousands of young lives each year in American cities. And the case serves as a warning to the thousands of other young people across America who are involved in gang culture, carrying guns, posting threats on social media, and believing they are invincible or that their youth will protect them from consequences. As Judge Gorman said in her sentencing remarks, "It's not cute, it's not fine, it's not a video game." Gun violence has permanent, irreversible consequences. For victims who die, for families who grieve, for witnesses who are traumatized, and for perpetrators who throw away their lives and freedom for moments of violence driven by disrespect, rivalry, or desire for status. Byron Jarvis thought his juvenile record would save him from serious consequences when he executed Davy Brown Bay on August 12, 2023. Instead, Judge Catherine Gorman sentenced him as an adult to 55 years in prison, with 20 years minimum before parole eligibility. The 16-year-old, who believed the system couldn't touch him, discovered too late that when juveniles commit adult crimes, American courts increasingly impose adult consequences. Byron will spend at least the next 18 years behind bars, his entire 20s and well into his 30s, paying for the choice he made at age 14 to ride up to Davy Brown Bay on a scooter and fire 4 bullets into him, including 3 execution-style shots to the head. That is the permanent, irreversible reality of gun violence and the juvenile justice system in 21st century America.